November 18th, 1952. The Sea of Japan. A Siberian blizzard rolling over the water. Visibility under 2 miles. Clouds starting at 500 feet. A 27-year-old Navy lieutenant named Royce Williams is alone in the sky, flying a jet that cannot outclimb, outrun, or outgun what is coming for him. 6 Soviet MiG-15s, 1 American F9F Panther. For the next 35 minutes, he will fight what military historians now call the longest aerial dogfight in United States Navy history. He will shoot down 4 enemy fighters, alone, outnumbered, in a jet his own Navy admitted was inferior in almost every way that mattered. And then his own government will order him to tell no one. Not the press, not most of his fellow officers, not his own wife. For 50 years, the greatest dogfight an American pilot ever survived did not exist on paper. He came home and carried the proudest day of his life as a secret he wasn't allowed to share with the one person closest to him. This is Echoes of Valor X. Today, we tell the true story of Captain Elmer Royce Williams. By 1952, the Korean War had hardened into a brutal stalemate. Task Force 77, the Navy's carrier strike group, flew daily missions off the coast of North Korea. Everyone on those carriers suspected what Washington refused to say in public, that many of the MiG-15s in the sky weren't flown by North Koreans or Chinese pilots at all. They were Soviet. Acknowledging that meant admitting the Cold War's 2 superpowers were already shooting at each other. Neither side could afford that conversation in 1952. Royce Williams was about to make that conversation unavoidable, which is exactly why it got buried instead. He was born April 4th, 1925, in Wilmot, South Dakota, a farming town near the Minnesota border, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business. His father, Elmer Williams Sr., had survived the First World War and come home to marry a local girl, Esther Foss, whose family ran the town's general store. Royce grew up the way a lot of South Dakota boys did in the 1930s, learning to swim, learning to shoot, earning his Eagle Scout rank, roping cattle on a neighbor's ranch well enough that decades later he'd still be lassoing his own grandkids for fun. Then came December 7th, 1941. At 17, he enlisted in the Navy. His flight training was deferred so he could finish college at the University of Minnesota first. By the time he qualified as a naval aviator in August 1945, the war that pulled him in was already ending. He stayed anyway, through the late 1940s, while most of his generation hung up their wings and went home. By 1952, he was a battle-ready lieutenant aboard the USS Oriskany, flying the F9F Panther, solid, but already a step behind what the Soviets had in the air. Every one of those extra training years was about to be the only thing standing between him and 7 enemy fighters at once. The morning of November 18th started as routine as a Cold War patrol could start. 4 Panthers climbed off the Oriskany into the storm. Lieutenant Claire Elwood and his wingman John Middleton in one pair, Williams and his wingman Dave Rowlands in the other. A classified NSA team embedded aboard the cruiser USS Helena picked up radio traffic the rest of the task force couldn't see. 7 Soviet MiG-15s lifting off near Vladivostok, heading straight for the American carrier group. Partway through the climb, Elwood's fuel pump warning light came on. He and Middleton turned back. That left Williams and Rowlands, 2 Panthers against 7 MiGs that outclassed them in speed, climb rate, and firepower. The Soviets split into 2 groups, trying to box the Americans in. Williams opened fire on the trailing jet, hit it, and watched it peel away trailing debris. That's when his wingman broke off to follow the falling MiG down. Royce Williams was alone. 1 Panther, 6 remaining Soviet fighters. The carrier's controllers, watching the math on radar, ordered him to disengage. He understood the order. He also understood there was no version of this fight left where disengaging was a real option. His reply, recorded on the radio log, "I am engaged." He had just told his own command, in a battle nobody back home would be allowed to know happened, that he was staying in it. Here's where it gets strange. The MiG-15 beat the F9F Panther in nearly every measurable category. On paper, 6 against 1 wasn't a dogfight. It was a formality. What the MiGs didn't account for was the one thing the Panther could still do better: turn tighter, at a lower speed, then they could follow. For half an hour, Williams flew on instinct, pulling impossibly tight turns inside the MiG's attack lines, forcing pilot after pilot to overshoot, firing in the half-second windows that opened when they did. One Soviet cannon round found his wing, knocking out every hydraulic system except the elevators. The MiG stayed locked on his tail as Williams dove for cloud cover at 500 feet. Too low, too slow, no working controls to spare. Inside the cloud, flying a wounded jet with an enemy still hunting him, Williams kept doing the only thing the aircraft would let him do, refusing to give the MiG a clean shot. By the time Rollins and Middleton fought back into range, one Soviet pilot had already ejected from a crippled jet. Rollins drove off the MiG chasing Williams just as the Panther broke out of the clouds at 400 feet. Too low to eject, streaming damage, heading straight toward a carrier group whose own gunners didn't recognize him and very nearly shot him down themselves. 35 minutes after it began, it was over. 4 Soviet MiG-15s down. The remaining 3 turned back for Vladivostok. Royce Williams had just become the only American pilot ever to single-handedly down 4 enemy fighters in one fight, and not one person outside that task force was allowed to know his name. His jet was barely flying. Below 195 miles per hour, it became uncontrollable. Standard landing speed on a Panther was 105 knots. Williams brought it in at 170 because anything slower and he couldn't keep it level. When the deck crew counted the damage, they found 263 holes in the aircraft, most from 23mm rounds, several from 37mm cannon fire. 1 round had gone through the wing into the engine. Years later, Williams would describe exactly how close it came. If it had been 6 inches forward, it would have hit the spar and blown my wing off. He had fired every one of his 760 rounds. There was nothing left to give the fight, and there was nothing left to give the aircraft either. The crew stripped what parts they could and pushed the wreck into the sea that same day. Williams climbed out of the cockpit and looked at what was left of his jet, by his own account stunned that he'd made it back at all. And then, before the adrenaline had even left his body, came the second order of the day: classified, tell no one. The mission had taken place in international airspace, but the implications were radioactive. American pilots had just fought and killed Soviet airmen in open combat, the kind of fact that could escalate a proxy war into something neither superpower could control. The Navy sealed the engagement. The gun camera footage was edited before anyone outside the immediate chain of command saw it. Williams received the Silver Star, a citation worded so carefully that almost no one reading it could have understood what it was actually for. He went home to a country that would spend the next 50 years not knowing what he had done for it. He didn't tell his children. For decades, he didn't tell his wife. Royce Williams served another 28 years in the Navy after that day. Vietnam, more carrier deployments, a full career, and retired as a captain in 1980, having spent nearly every one of those years bound by an order given in the middle of a snowstorm in 1952. When people eventually asked him, much later in life, how he carried it, his answer was almost unsettlingly plain. I was a fighter pilot doing my job. He wasn't shooting at anything he hadn't been given. The MiGs had him cold on speed and maneuverability. The only thing I could do was outturn them. That was the entire explanation he ever felt he owed anyone, including for half a century, the people who loved him most. The truth didn't surface until 1992, when declassified Soviet military records confirmed from the other side exactly what Royce Williams had done over the Sea of Japan 40 years earlier. The American side of the record wasn't declassified until 2016, 64 years after the fight itself. By then, Royce Williams was in his 90s. In 2023, his Silver Star was finally upgraded to the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest decoration, after a decade-long campaign led by South Dakota lawmakers. The Secretary of the Navy at the time said that of every award upgrade that crossed his desk, Williams's case stood out above all the others. It still wasn't finished. On February 24, 2026, at 100 years old, Royce Williams received the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, presented during a State of the Union address, 74 years after the mission that earned it. He is the last living Medal of Honor recipient of the Korean War. A month later, his home state placed a plaque bearing his name in the Hall of Honor at the South Dakota State Capitol, a farm town's son, permanently written into the same building where his state's laws are made. He was 100 years old by then, too far from California to make the trip. The governor unveiled it without him and said on his behalf what Royce Williams had spent 50 years unable to say himself, that in spite of being outnumbered and facing incredible danger, he had engaged the enemy with courage and skill, and that South Dakota's long tradition of service had never produced anyone better. If your father or grandfather ever came home from a war and never talked about what happened over there, you already know something about what Royce Williams carried for 50 years without complaint. Tell me his name in the comments. Tell me what he never said out loud, because here is what's worth sitting with. A man can do the single most remarkable thing of his life, and his own country can decide the world isn't allowed to know. And somehow, the hardest part wasn't the silence the Navy ordered. It was the silence he kept at his own kitchen table for decades, with the one person he should never have had to keep anything from. He waited 50 years to tell his own wife what he did that day. What would you have done if he'd been ordered to keep the bravest thing you ever did a secret from the person you loved most? Subscribe so these men are never forgotten.